Hello! Here we are going to endeavor to present a commentary on the Gospel of Mark, which we pray is the fruitful beginning of many such projects. The reason we have chosen to present Mark before Matthew is not because we believe that Mark was written first, we don't, but because Mark shares almost all of its accounts with Matthew and Luke. Around 97% of the accounts in Mark are also found in at least one of those other two Gospels. If we, for example, presented Matthew first, there would be a lot of redundancy in going to Mark second. I think Mark is a very excellent introduction to the Gospels as a whole, so we thought it would be more appropriate to begin with Mark. We are also hoping to present a series on Paul's epistle to the Romans, either alongside with this commentary on Mark or afterwards. But Yahweh willing, we will also present that series. It won't be a commentary. It's going to be more of a quick summary defense showing the most key points that demonstrate that Paul of Tarsus was in no way a universalist, but in every way one of the earliest teachers of what we call today Christian identity. Now, many modern critics, they try to reposition Mark to be the first gospel, and they fail. Scrutiny exposes their hypocritical methods as nothing more than vain attempts to attack Christianity. Their claims are entirely unfounded. They hold no water, but they're also unfortunately popular. So we thought it would be appropriate to begin this introduction to Mark by deconstructing these lies of Marcan priority and discussing the real eyewitness source of the Gospels. Through all this, we will see that the preponderance of evidence points towards Mark being written third, not first. And from there we will examine the history and the composition of this vivid gospel in detail. So this introduction might be lengthy, but I think all of this information is pertinent to the discussion. Now, while we're deconstructing Marcan priority, we're going to be, for a time, entertaining their presuppositions, and we're going to be using and following their methods, even though we don't agree with them. We don't agree with their methods. We don't agree with their presuppositions, but we're going to entertain them for a while just to show how flawed they are, to show how they don't work. Then, once we finish doing that, then we're going to explore the real and legitimate way to study the Gospels. It is unanimously attested to by all of the early Christian writers that Matthew wrote his Gospel first. And that is notably significant considering how often those writers would disagree on other issues. Now, in all their literature, there is nothing at all which can be found to discredit their testimony that Matthew was written first. And for this reason, the veracity of Matthew's antecedents was never challenged until the shifting politics of the 19th century basically made it a necessity. So the idea of Marcan priority is quite new. Throughout the 19th and early 20th century, Marcan priority was being popularized among academics as part of the broader efforts to address the so-called synoptic problem, which really isn't a problem at all. The so-called synoptic problem is really only a question. It's a question as to why the three synoptic gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke have so much material in common. And they do, and sometimes they even share language and grammar in their clauses. Why? Well, the answer is relatively simple for those who are willing to follow where the evidence leads. But for those who found that answer particularly inconvenient or undesirable, it was suggested that the synoptic problem was indicative of extensive copying instead. Yes, there was likely some copying between the Gospels, but nowhere near as systematic as they claim it is, as they make it out to be. These critics, they really abandon any acknowledgement of the Gospels coming from an eyewitness source, and they literally think that they were solely copies of one another. Solely. And we will be seeing that. And that's a lie. Now, the presupposition that the Gospels are largely copies from one another, well, that makes Mark stand out like a sore thumb. Mark is shorter. It's the shortest Gospel, and it has the least unique material. Again, as we said earlier, 97% of the passages in Mark are also found in one of the other two Synoptic Gospels. So, taking that into account, how then could Mark have copied from Matthew? It is difficult to rationalize why Mark would have chosen to retract so much material from Matthew while choosing to add so little new material in return. That would really make Mark nothing more than an abridged version of Matthew. And if that's the case, why even write the Gospel in the first place? This peculiarity was used to support the theory that Mark couldn't have been written first, and that Matthew and Luke must have copied from Mark instead, and are therefore redactions of that Gospel. And while that may seem reasonable at first, it just doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Pulling Mark forward like this presented a difficult conundrum for these critics as to how Matthew and Luke could agree with each other whenever Mark is not able to be followed. They do not ever take into account eyewitness sources. Never. Again, they just think the Gospel's only copied from other manuscripts. I guess forever. So the critics would wonder, how are Matthew and Luke agreeing when they can't follow Mark as a source? Well, they conjectured there must be two sources. But what would the second source be? It can't be John. So what would this second source be? What is the option? There wasn't one. So, from the recesses of the abyss, a new phantom manuscript was formed, conjured up out of thin air. Today we call it Q, from Quell, German for source. The Q source. The Q source was conjectured to have been the second source for both Matthew and Luke. So wherever they couldn't follow Mark, they followed Q instead. This facile theory eventually became popular enough to balloon Mark in priority into what is now known today as the two-source theory. But there is, of course, no credible evidence that Q ever existed. None of the early Christian writers, as prolific as they were, provide even the slightest word of acknowledgement of its existence, not even the most slightest reference, not even the slightest hint. It is a mind-bender to imagine that Q was secretive enough to have eluded all these early Christian writers, but somehow still influential enough to have been a source for both Matthew and Luke. That's a bit of a stretch, right? Q must also have vanished back into the abyss as soon as Matthew and Luke were written, which is awfully convenient. Now, the more critical scholar will confess that there is no evidence that the golden calf of Q ever existed. And this may be an unfortunate reality for some, but it doesn't trouble us at all. Now, the case for Markan priority isn't any stronger without Q, and it can be soundly refuted just by looking at the ordering of events in the Gospels and comparing where they differ. So we're going to bring up a chart here. And in this chart, we see all three synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And we're seeing the ordering of the events in the synoptic Gospels. Where Matthew and Luke follow the ordering of Mark, we see them in bold. And just quickly looking at this, we will notice something very peculiar. That Matthew and Luke only follow Mark where the other Gospel doesn't. They're taking turns. That is really intriguing. Now, was there an exhaustive and complex collaboration between Matthew and Luke? Were the two men sitting in the same room as they meticulously divided Mark? Was this some sort of conspiracy? That's a bit hard to believe. Perhaps then we could conjecture that the third author, maybe it was Luke, had the scrolls laid out in front of him, Matthew and Mark, as he painstakingly deliberated to only follow Mark in the places where Matthew didn't. Now, these scrolls would be quite long, right? And they're not easily parsed. So he would have to go and walk back and forth between Matthew and Mark, seeing where their accounts agree, right? What a needlessly complex and superfluous effort. It is vain to imagine that the gospel writers would go through such an excruciating trouble for no apparent reason at all. That's just silly. It's very silly to imagine them doing that. But there is, of course, another possibility, which is that Mark was written third and naturally balances the ordering between the other two gospels. This hypothesis is not complex, and neither is it hard to imagine. It actually quite makes sense. And while we don't prefer these types of methods, it can be supported with a more technical analysis. As New Testament scholar Malcolm Lowe reached the following tally upon calculating the probability of priority for each of these shared accounts one by one. So he counted 90 of them, he went to them one by one, and using an algebraic formula, he calculated if each one was more indicative of Mark being written first or third. And he came to the calculation for first, 57 out of 90, but for third, 88 out of 90. That's quite a difference. Now, again, while we certainly do not prefer this methodology, we do entertain it for a reason. It does serve to show that the evidence in our favor is not restricted to any peculiar method or reason. We're not cherry picking here. And even the very means of textual criticism, which the critics love so much, fails to work in their own favor. Now, the technicality behind Lowe's algebraic formula, what actual formula he used to reach this conclusion, that's available in the footnotes. I don't think it's really important. I find all of those methods really vain and contrived, honestly. But it is there if anybody is interested. Now, considering the dearth of historical evidence for Markan priority and for Q, most of the arguments today are now structured around obscure and specious methods of counting or analyzing how words are patterned. If that sounds really desperate, that's because it is. Unfortunately for the critics, these deceptive methods are all reversible. For example, it is often claimed by the scoffers that you can see Mark's language being borrowed by Matthew. Okay, but you can also say that Matthew's language is being borrowed by Mark. The argument is reversible, right? They just assume Mark was written first. So that's a silly argument, but you really do see people use it. So-called experts will use it in their essays. They really do. Anyways. Now another is the so-called criterion of embarrassment. And that's a good label because it should be embarrassing if anybody takes it seriously. Now there are many people who take this method seriously or have been duped by it, and they're desperate. They have nothing else. Come on, you have to give them something. Okay. The criterion of embarrassment suggests that the later gospel writers would omit anything from the earlier source which they found offensive or embarrassing, ostensibly because that is what the critics would do, and they like to project onto the gospel writers. This is, of course, a presumptuous claim, especially considering that the Bible is never shy to proclaim things which society finds offensive. And we are confident that not one writer of the scriptures was ever ashamed of its testimony. The motives of these scoffers, it's all transparent as glass, and their hypothesis is just about that fragile. The most common example of this so-called criterion of embarrassment used in defense of Marcan priority is that Mark is the only gospel writer which records the family of Christ calling him insane. Now, in regards to this account, it's not quite clear if his family said this in ignorance or because they thought it was an expedient way to wrestle him away from the crowd. Regardless of what might have been the case, John does provide a relatively similar circumstance when he notes that some of Christ's brothers did not believe in him. It was also recorded by John, the words of Christ concerning the symbolic eating of his flesh and blood, and that is certainly more quote-unquote offensive than anything which could ever be found in Mark. So considering all this, was John written first then? Was it John? No one would ever go that far. But it's also hard to think of anything in Mark which is more charged than John 8:44. You are the sons of the false accuser. Or Luke 19:27. If they don't want me to be king, kill them here in front of me. Not many are brazen enough to be branded upon claiming that John or Luke were written first. Not many. But if this method can be used to uphold Marcan priority, then they're all for it. Of course, they're just assuming Mark was written first. The most embarrassing part of this whole embarrassment criteria is that it's entirely subjective and reliant on whoever is determining the criteria. What's embarrassing to one person might not be embarrassing to another, and we can see how this method, too, is reversible. If anything, the honesty in how the Gospels relate their bolder accounts is a testimony towards their authenticity, and there is nothing offensive to the Christian man in the Scriptures. Perhaps those who love the society are offended, but scoffers don't know how to read words. They only know how to count them. Now, reading from the Gospel of Mark itself, Christ says, "For whoever should be ashamed of me and my words among this adulterous and sinful race, also the Son of Man shall be ashamed of him when he should come in the honor of his Father with the holy messengers." So anybody who upholds this idea of embarrassment criteria, they do so at their own peril. We'll offer one last example. This one is called editorial fatigue. It's grown quite popular in recent years, ostensibly because the scoffers and the critics are becoming increasingly fatigued and helpless. This one conjectures. This one's brilliant. This one's just brilliant. This one conjectures, in all its radiant brilliance, that an author borrowing from a source might edit or clarify material as he goes along, but then later forget about his edit and revert back to the original wording of his source. One of the most common examples of this so-called editorial fatigue, given in defense of Marcan priority, is with the account of Herod and his birthday feast. So if we compare Mark and Matthew's account, we'll see. Now Mark calls Herod king, but Matthew calls him tetrarch. So they assume that Matthew was copying from Mark, and he saw that Mark called Herod king, and Matthew thought, no, well, the more technically correct term would be tetrarch. So Matthew writes down tetrarch in place of king. He continues to copy from Mark, and then writes king later, forgetting that he clarified it as tetrarch earlier, therefore allegedly betraying his source, showing that he was copying from Mark. Another so-called example of editorial fatigue is that maybe an author is copying from an earlier work, and say Matthew is copying from Mark, and in Mark, Christ harkens back to an event recorded earlier in that gospel. But Matthew, while copying from Mark, chose to omit that passage. He didn't include it in his gospel, but he forgot about that, and he still records Christ hearkening back to it, therefore betraying his source, because that account is not in his gospel, but it is in Mark. He must have been copying from Mark and omitted it. That's the idea. If we just think about all this for 10 seconds only, we can see how it's some of the most ridiculous nonsense we've ever heard. It is so hard to imagine that someone writing the most important work of their life would have the memory of a goldfish and goof up like this. Was Matthew an amnesiac? Did he have amnesia? Was he not looking back and checking what he was writing? Do they really think that these men were that dim-witted? I think the scoffers and the critics are once again projecting. The desperation of the critics has made them harebrained. And as you would expect, this argument is once again reversible. You can find an equal amount of evidence pointing in either direction. And many scholars have done so. Many scholars have found evidence of Mark having copied from Matthew. This method is just as contrived and circular as all the ones which came before. It is simply taken for granted every time that Mark was written first. There is no evidence that Mark was written first. There is no historical testimony. All they have are these contrived methods of counting and rhyming words, and all of them are reversible, contrived, and hypocritical. So we should wonder why the scoffers still go to all these fallacious lengths instead of just being deductive in their reasoning, instead of just being honest about where the evidence leads. Of course, maybe there's an agenda in the works, and there certainly is. These critics who uphold Marcan priority usually have an axe to grind. We already hinted at some of these political motivations earlier, but now we're going to see how they go a little deeper than what we already described. Marcan priority was first proposed in the late 18th century by German Protestant theologian Gottlob Christian Storr. And it was met with very little approval at his time. He was basically laughed at. It wasn't until Ferdinand Christian Bauer founded the Tübingen School of Theology, a school which politicized the way in which the New Testament is studied, that this hypothesis of Marcan priority even started to be seriously considered. Funny, Marcan priority was never seriously considered until the study of the New Testament became political. Now Bauer, his methods were the groundwork for many of the fallacious arguments still used today, and we explored many of those brilliant arguments earlier. The Tübingen School was attractive for Bauer's contemporary, David Friedrich Strauss, who later wrote a book claiming that the miracles of the Gospels were embellishments and not representative of the historical Christ. So Strauss was an antichrist. Now, Strauss was a controversial figure at his time, deservedly so, and despised by many of his peers. Even effigies of him were burned by the common people during a festival in Switzerland. We would agree with those crowds that this was an appropriate response to his ideas. Now, while Strauss never seemed to have endorsed Marcan priority would undoubtedly be attractive for later men who would share Strauss's views that the miracles of the Gospels are mere embellishments. Mark, for example, has no account of the virgin birth, which Strauss considered to be legendary. Neither does it have any resurrection appearances, while Matthew has both these things. It was always difficult for the scoffers to acknowledge with strained lips and gritted teeth that such miracles are recorded in the earliest account. So, in their desperation, they had to have Mark pigeonholed forward, and they would do that by any means possible. These necessities led to Marcan priority being elevated as an idol among the scoffers. Now, of course, these people are all fools, because Mark has many wonderful miracles. It has the raising of Jairus' daughter, the transfiguration on the mount, Christ walking on water, countless healings, and also it, of course, records Christ foretelling his resurrection 3 times. Even though there are no resurrection appearances in Mark's gospel, Christ does foretell it 3 times. So again, these men are much better at counting and rhyming words than they are at reading them. Because the so-called academic institutions, by default, deny Christianity, it is absolutely necessary for them to uphold Marcan priority. Absolutely necessary. And the enemies of Christ, who I can't name here in this video, well, they legitimize and they fund these ideas through their stranglehold over academia, media, and politics. Propaganda only becomes more pervasive the longer it is taught. The longer a lie is taught, the more it's accepted as truth. It's just taken for granted. Those who are rolled through the machine are taught Marcan priority by their professors who learned the same concept from their own teachers. Graduates in any field are always inclined to adopt the prevailing thought, especially for areas outside of their expertise. No man can be an expert in everything. No man can be well studied in everything. So men are inclined to adopt the prevailing thought, especially for areas outside of their expertise, and to challenge the status quo often amounts to vocational suicide anyways, given that your livelihood in these industries is determined in a publish or perish environment. You're not going to be really popular in New Testament textual criticism if you believe that Christ is true. The whole industry revolves around denying Christ. And while there are more volatile issues at hand than Marcan priority, many men are hesitant to become even the slightest pariah. So they just keep their mouths shut. This is the same fear of the Jew which silenced many Israelites among the Pharisees who believed in Christ. These are the same lies which have anthropologists claim that gender doesn't exist, even though they spend their lives looking at skeletons. Modern academia is a Jewish cancer. But Christians should not fear their fear, nor should they be deceived by these institutions which are themselves bereft of the fear of God. The historical testimony that Matthew was written first is simply overwhelming. And there would never be any debate whatsoever. If this were a classical work of Greek literature, it's only because it's the Bible that men deny it. But if this were a classical work of Greek literature, no one would deny the historical testimonies. No one would deny the internal evidence that Matthew was written first. No one would deny it because no one would have an axe to grind. No one would have any vendetta against Herodotus. No one would have any vendetta against Strabo. But men certainly do have agendas against Christ. Matthew was also the primary gospel quoted by early Christians. It did not inexplicably supplant the first gospel, it was the first gospel. Marcan priority is basically a form of biblical minimalism for the New Testament. People who uphold this idea are basically whores for men like Israel Finkelstein. Marcan priority is unfounded, and it relies on games of counting words as its only form of life support. The arguments are all reversible, they are all fallacious, and they are all vanity, and many of those who support these theories are likely walking vanities themselves. If the critics are so adamant upon rejecting the scriptures, then the onus is on them to explain its prophetic aspects. With all this being said, we can now begin to discuss the real source of the gospel, the real source, the eyewitness source, how it was transmitted, and the relationship between the gospels. The historical criteria is so much more valuable than the increasingly desperate methods of the scoffers, and it actually aligns with the internal evidence instead of contradicting it. The apostles emphasized time and time again that they were eyewitnesses of Christ, and the character of the Gospels indisputably aligns with that testimony. From the words of Christ himself, "But you, the apostles, you also shall testify, because you are with me from the beginning." And as Peter wrote in his second surviving epistle, "For not following after cleverly devised myths, have we made known to you the power and presence of our Prince Yahshua Christ, but having been spectators of his majesty." Spectators of his majesty. These spectators of Christ, they had arranged many reports. And men such as Luke, who had never seen the prince, compiled their testimonies as well as those of other eyewitnesses. So we either have it coming straight from eyewitnesses themselves, such as Matthew and John and Peter, or from second-hand witnesses, those who didn't see Christ but compiled the testimonies of those who did, such as Luke. And Luke writes in the opening of his gospel, "Seeing that many have taken in hand to arrange a report concerning those matters fully ascertained among us, just as they who from the beginning, having been eyewitnesses and attendants of the word, transmitted them to us, it seemed good also to me, having closely followed from the first in all things accurately, to write to you methodically, most excellent lover of Yahweh, that you may decide concerning the certainty of the accounts which you were taught." It is possible, and even likely, that Luke used Matthew's gospel as a resource. But the different details which Luke provides in their shared accounts between Matthew and Luke, it does show that he consulted the testimonies of others. Otherwise, there would be no difference. This he implies himself in his introduction, where he shows and demonstrates and confesses that he's using many sources. One of these would have actually been Miriam, the mother of Christ, whom Luke records in his gospel as having kept all these words in her heart. Luke, who was an exacting and thorough historian, must have either interviewed her or recorded some of her memories at some point, or might have just perhaps remembered whatever she had told him in the past. Miriam would have been the only first-hand source for much of what is related in Luke's opening 2 chapters, since other witnesses who were there, such as Elizabeth or Zacharias, Joseph, Simeon, or Anna, by the time Luke wrote his gospel. So it must have been Miriam. Though Luke likely used Matthew as a reference, and that negates any need for Q, because now where we see agreement, it doesn't have to be Matthew and Luke copying from some Q source, it can just be Luke copying from Matthew. So while Luke likely used Matthew as a reference, it was certainly not some systematic operation. Otherwise, the shared accounts between the 2 Gospels would have always been verbatim with one another, but they're not. These are different perspectives. Now, the critics, they try to explain these different perspectives away with their beloved Phantom Q. But in their customary hypocrisy, they also try to use Q to explain where they agree. So, whenever they disagree, it's Q, and whenever they agree, it's Q. They cannot have it both ways. How many cues were there, and where was this secretive library located? Why don't we ever see such harmony in the fraudulent apocryphal gospels? Why don't the apocryphal gospels have all this harmony? Did they not have access to Q? Was Q only reserved for the apostles then? And if it was, why would eyewitnesses need it? The character of the gospels and their subtle differences in detail are indeed all indicative of human memory, as different men will recall different details concerning the same event. The fact that they present all these details without ever contradicting one another, that multiplies their veracity fourfold. The truth is simple. How easy it is to love the truth. The scoffers who can count words but are grossly unable to read them, they often resort to calling these different perspectives contradictions, and they are indeed fools. Just because one man is mentioned in a gospel doesn't negate the possibility of there being two. And if Christ is recorded as having gone to two different places, then perhaps one was the ultimate destination and the other was the next point on the road. It is arrogant, absolutely arrogant, to assume that varying perspectives are contradictions when they can easily be made to work harmoniously. And they can be. One of the most enjoyable parts of studying the Gospels, in my opinion, is seeing how they weave together so beautifully. And they do. It's like a tapestry. A simple and excellent example is the feeding of the 5,000. And this is an example which is commonly given. The feeding of the 5,000 is recorded in all four Gospels, at Matthew 14, 13 to 21, Mark chapter 6, verses 30 to 44, Luke chapter 9, verses 10 to 17, and John chapter 6, verses 1 to 14. If we compare these accounts, we will notice very subtle yet profound harmonies. For instance, every gospel, except Luke, mentions that the people sat on the grass. And John is the one that notes that there is much of it, there's much grass. Now, this may appear like an insignificant detail, but it suggests something. This suggests that it was during the rainy winter season. And that is confirmed once we see in John that it was indeed the Passover, which is in April on our modern calendars. The fact that it was Passover also explains why Mark wrote that there were many people coming and going, right? They're all coming to Jerusalem for the feast, as they're obliged to do. Josephus estimated that perhaps 2.7 million people were present in Jerusalem for the Passover in 70 AD. And if that number is true, that would have been during the Judean revolts, right? There would have been even more people coming for the Passover during the time of Christ. So that's one example of harmony. It is only recorded in John that Joshua specifically asked Philip where they could buy food. Joshua was trying Philip. He knew what he was about to do. Now, John mentions that Philip was from Bethsaida, the town Bethsaida. John mentions this elsewhere in his gospel. Luke records that this miracle occurred in or around that very same town. So through comparing Luke and John, we can see why Christ asked Philip. Philip was from the area, and he would have been expected to know about the local markets. Yahweh willing, we will show more harmonies like these as we go through the Gospel of Mark, of which many are quite subtle and profound, and they show the veracity of these accounts time and time again. These are sometimes called undesigned coincidences. Coincidences. They're not coincidences. Not at all. They are emblematic of eyewitness testimony. That is what they are. Just earlier in this presentation, and if they were coincidences, why would we see so many? Why would we see so many and never any contradictions? Now that is a coincidence. Now just earlier in this presentation, we looked at a chart which showed the ordering of accounts in the Synoptic Gospels. And there are two things which should be kept in mind if we are going to ask why sometimes these events are ordered differently in the Gospels. The first thing we should keep in mind is this: that many passages and parables throughout the Gospels are placed in sequences according to their theme or their didactic value, which allows them to impart even more resounding lessons. So you may see many teachings and parables concerning treasure in heaven grouped together, right? Even though they might not necessarily be chronologically linked, or maybe they were. Maybe they were, because the second is that Christ repeated many of his teachings at diverse times and places. Christ, he had a ministry of 3.5 years. You can determine that it was 3.5 years by counting the Passovers in John, and comparing that to how Luke dated the beginning of the ministry of Christ. That would align with the prophecy of Daniel, because in the prophecy of the 70 weeks in Daniel 9, it says that the Messiah confirms the covenant with many for 1 week, but is cut off in the midst of the week. Crucified, right? Well, half of 7 is 3.5, so cut off in the midst of the week. So Christ, he had a ministry of 3.5 years. And we can't expect that during that 3.5 years, he gave each of the parables and teachings recorded to us in the Gospels, that he gave them each once. He likely repeated them many times at diverse places. There is proof of this. For example, the famous Olivet Discourse. It's recorded in all 3 Synoptic Gospels. It takes place during that final week in Jerusalem on the Mount of Olives. That's why it's called the Olivet Discourse, right? Well, many people would assume that that was the only place and time Christ ever gave that sort of teaching. But if we look at Luke, we see that that simply is not the case. Luke describes Christ giving a shorter version of the Olivet Discourse in Luke 17 before the actual Olivet Discourse is recorded at Luke 21. So this shows us that a teaching of that general theme was at minimum given on 2 separate occasions. And that's just one example. So as for the ordering of the events in the Gospels, they're often ordered thematically, and Christ, he gave these teachings and parables several different times anyways. So there is no contradiction. And you would have to be pretty foolish to think there was. With this being said, we will now finally start turning our heads to the Gospel of Mark, its authorship and its composition. We will now take some time to discuss the origin of Mark's Gospel. Virtually all of the early Christian writers agree that John Mark is the author of this Gospel. We once again see unanimous agreement. And they also agree that Mark compiled this Gospel from the preaching of Peter. We will see how all of this perfectly aligns with the peculiar style of Mark's Gospel, and Mark does indeed have a peculiar style. The earliest surviving witness regarding Mark's authorship is Papias, or Papias, who wrote in the early 2nd century. And while Papias' works are now lost, we do read a quote of his from Eusebius, and Eusebius writes, "And the presbyter, elder, said this: Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately whatsoever he remembered. It was not, however, in exact order that he related the sayings or deeds of Christ, for he neither heard the Lord nor accompanied him. But afterwards, as I said, he accompanied Peter, who accommodated his instructions to the necessities, but with no intention of giving a regular narrative of the Lord's sayings. Wherefore Mark made no mistake in thus writing some things as he remembered them. For of one thing he took especial care, not to omit anything he had heard, and not to put anything fictitious into the statements. So we see that Papias relates the testimony he received, that Mark was an interpreter of Peter, and that Mark carefully compiled his gospel from whatever he remembered from Peter's preaching. Papias, he also wrote elsewhere that he was keen to learn what the ambassadors said from those who had heard the ambassadors. And this makes Papias' early witness to the authorship of Mark that much more notable. This we see in another quotation of Papias from Eusebius. And we read, and these are the words, the alleged words of Papias. If then anyone came who had been a follower of the elders, I question him in regard to the words of the elders, what Andrew or what Peter said, or what was said by Philip, or by Thomas, or by James, or by John, or by Matthew, or by any other of the disciples of the Lord, and what things Aristion and the presbyter elder John, the disciples of the Lord, say. For I did not think that what was to be gotten from the books would profit me as much as what came from the living and abiding voice. And that's Eusebius's Ecclesiastical History, Book 3 again, and also the same chapter. Now, Eusebius, he also quoted the 2nd century writer Clement of Alexandria, who had this to say concerning the Gospel of Mark. And we read, the Gospels containing the genealogies, he says, were written first. The Gospel according to Mark had this occasion. As Peter had preached the word publicly in Rome and declared the Gospel by the Spirit, many who were present requested that Mark, who had followed him for a long time and remembered his sayings, should write them out. And having composed the Gospel, he gave it to those who had requested it. When Peter learned of this, he neither directly forbade nor encouraged it. And that's Eusebius's Ecclesiastical History, Book 6. So Clement of Alexandria agrees with Papias that Mark was a follower of Peter and that he compiled his gospel from Peter's preaching, adding that Mark was allegedly encouraged by many in Rome to do so. Clement also expresses his belief that Matthew and Luke were written first, the Gospels with the genealogies, and that is certainly where the evidence leads, so we would agree with him there. Now, Papias, he seemed to imply that Mark, he wrote his Gospel after Peter died, but here Clement of Alexandria, he says that Mark wrote his Gospel while Peter was still living. So that certainly is a contradiction, right? That's what a real contradiction looks like, because there is no way to make those be harmonious. That's what a real contradiction looks like. Yes, we do see those with the early Christian writers. We're not looking at this to try to find the precise story of how Mark composed his gospel and the circumstances under which he did so. It's likely impossible to come to that conclusion, or at least very difficult. All we're doing here is just seeing where they unanimously agree. So while they do disagree on some aspects, there is one thing they agree upon, two things. That the gospel was written by Mark and that he compiled it from Peter's preaching. That is what we're looking for here, and we're seeing unanimous agreement. Continuing with Eusebius, we see that he also quotes the 3rd century writer Origen. And we read, the second is by Mark. So Origen disagreed that Mark was written 3rd. Clement, he believed Mark was written 3rd. Origen here, he believed that Mark was written 2nd. The second is by Mark, who composed it according to the instructions of Peter, who in his Catholic epistle, general epistle, acknowledges him as a son, saying, "The church that is at Babylon, elected, together with you, salutes you, and so does Marcus, my son." The church that is at Babylon, elected together with you. That's not what we read in our copies of 1 Peter. Peter says the elect woman of Babylon. I guess Origen interpreted that as a church there, but there's not more than one church. There is one wife of Christ, and that's Israel, right? That's the one ecclesia. So his interpretation is wrong. Peter there is referring to, ostensibly, his wife. And Peter did have a wife, and we see that in the Gospels. Anyways, we do see that Origen agrees with the earlier writers, Clement of Alexandria and Papias, that the Gospel of Mark was written by Mark according to the instructions or preaching of Peter. Another witness concerning the Gospel's authorship is found in the 2nd century writer Irenaeus. And we read in Irenaeus' Against Heresies, Book 3. Matthew also issued a gospel. Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect. So that can be a reference either to the Hebrew language itself, and there is evidence that Matthew was originally written in Hebrew, or Irenaeus might be referring to a Hebrew dialect of Greek. It doesn't appear to be certain what Irenaeus meant by that. Returning to Irenaeus, Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect, while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome and laying the foundations of the church. Peter and Paul preaching together in Rome, that is extremely doubtful. And we'll be talking about that later. Returning to Irenaeus, after their departure, the departure of Peter and Paul, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, did also hand down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. Luke also, the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached by him. Afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who had also leaned upon his breast, did himself publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia. So we see with Irenaeus yet another witness that Mark was Peter's interpreter, and that he compiled his gospel from Peter's preaching. Irenaeus also claims that Mark did so after Peter died, and that certainly does seem to be the case. Another witness is the 2nd century writer Justin Martyr. And we read from his dialogue with Trypho, "And when it is said that he changed the name of one of the apostles to Peter, and when it is written in the memoirs of him that this so happened, as well as that he changed the name of other 2 brothers, the sons of Zebedee, to Boanerges, which means sons of thunder." There is no doubt whatsoever that Justin Martyr is referring to the Gospel of Mark here, where he mentions the memoirs of Peter, because the Gospel of Mark is the only gospel which records Christ labeling the sons of Zebedee with the name Boanerges. So that is definitely Mark, and we see that Justin Martyr calls it the memoirs of Peter. There are other witnesses concerning Mark, but what we have presented here should be more than sufficient for our purposes. While these early historical testimonies are useful, once again, we should reiterate that we should never use them as a source for any kind of doctrine. Apostolic Christianity was quickly Judaized and paganized after the departure of the apostles. Scripture is the only legitimate source. But what we do see here is that the early writers unanimously agree that this gospel was written by Mark. It is important for us, therefore, to see what the scriptures inform us concerning the life of this man. Mark had a second name, like many people in the Bible, John. As we read in Acts 12 and Acts 15, that he is Johannes, who is called Marcus. Luke simply calls him John in Acts 13:5 and 13:13, and also just calls him Mark in Acts 15:39. So the names are interchangeable for him. However, he's only ever referred to as Mark in the surviving epistles of Paul and Peter. Men in ancient times, they often went by more than one name, as there was no concept of a legal name back then. That concept only exists today as a means for the government to just exact more control over our lives. It really does. But I'm not going to digress on that point. Now, Peter, he certainly affirms through his own words that he had a close bond with Mark, where he affectionately calls him his son in the salutation of his first surviving epistle. And we saw Origen earlier refer to that. So Peter and Mark were undoubtedly close. Peter being older than Mark, we can imagine that their friendship was somewhat similar to that of Paul and Timothy. Peter, he fled to the house of Mary, the mother of Mark, in Antioch, after Yahweh sent a messenger to rescue him from prison there. So Peter must have known Mark from 41 to 44 AD at the very latest. By the time Peter wrote that epistle, where he mentions Mark is my son, that would have been at least 20 years later. So Peter had known Mark for quite a long time. But it's also possible that Peter knew Mark from a time even earlier than when he was released in prison in Antioch and went to the house of Mark's mother. That is because Mark is the cousin of Barnabas. Barnabas had joined the early Christian community before the martyrdom of Stephanus. So Barnabas would have been familiar to the apostles from a very early time. Stephen would have been martyred before 35 AD. So it's possible that if Mark was with Barnabas, that the apostles were familiar with Mark even from that time. Barnabas would come to be trusted among the brethren, as his confidence in Paul had apparently assuaged their initial fear of him when Paul came and tried to join the students in Jerusalem. Barnabas was known as Joseph when he first met the ambassadors, but they renamed him Son of Consolation, which is what Barnabas means. So it is evident that Barnabas was of good repute among the apostles. It is also noted by Luke that Barnabas was a Levite. So it is possible that Mark was as well, and this would fit well with his role as Peter's transcriber. Many Levites would have roles as scribes in ancient times, right? It is logical to assume that many Levites during the time of Christ would have still been continuing the vocations of their fathers. And we can see Levites and their common professions as scribes. We can see that in 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, and Ezra. Ezra was a Levite, and he was a scribe. We can also look at Matthew, who is called Levi in the Gospels. So Matthew had at least two names. And if Matthew was a Levite, then that would explain his role as a tax collector. So it's possible that Mark was a Levite, because Barnabas was. And that would explain why he had a role as a transcriber for Peter. Now Mark, he traveled with Barnabas and Paul as an assistant during their journey through Cyprus. And that was circa 44 AD. Barnabas himself was a Cypriot by birth, though he was evidently living in Judea throughout the early years recorded in Acts. After journeying across the island, they sailed to Pamphylia in Asia, and at that time Mark withdrew from them and returned to Jerusalem. This did not leave a good impression on Paul, It certainly wasn't a feast, because if it was, Paul and Barnabas would have gone with him. So we don't know why Mark left. Now, around 48 AD, Paul and Barnabas, so this is 2 or 3 years later, maybe 4, I can't quite remember. Paul and Barnabas, they went to Jerusalem for the council in 48 AD. And after that council, the apostles, they sent Paul and Barnabas to Antioch with a letter for the uncircumcised. So they went and they read the letter before the uncircumcised there, and the people rejoiced. And Paul and Barnabas, they spent some considerable time in Antioch. And while they're in Antioch, at some point, Mark was there. So once again, Paul, Barnabas, and John Mark all found themselves in Antioch. Honestly, it's not really surprising to see John Mark in Antioch, given that his mother had a house in the city, of course. Now, after spending considerable time there, in Antioch, Paul suggested to Barnabas that they return to some of the cities in Asia where they announced the gospel and see how well they were holding up. Barnabas wished for Mark to join them on this journey, but Paul was reluctant to bring Mark along, because last time he went on a journey with them, he withdrew from them and returned to Jerusalem. And we read this in Acts. Then after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Now turning, we should visit the brethren throughout every city in which we declare the word of the prince, how they sustain, to see how they hold up." And Barnabas was resolved to take along also Johannes, his cousin, who is called Marcus. But Paul thought it not fitting to bring him along, who withdrew from them, from Pamphylia, and did not go together with them to the work. And there is irritation, consequently for them to depart from each other, and for Barnabas taking Marcus to sail off to Cyprus. Now there is much which occurred during this time in Antioch, which Luke simply does not record in Acts. Acts is very abbreviated, but so is the whole Bible. We see a glimpse of some of the other things which had occurred during this time in Antioch in Paul's epistle to the Galatians. But when Cephas, Peter, had come to Antioch, I had confronted him personally, because he was condemning himself. For before some who were to come from Jacobos, James, he had eaten in common with the nations. But when they had came, he withdrew and separated himself, being in fear of those of the circumcised. And also the rest of the Judeans had acted with him, so that even Barnabas had been led away by them in hypocrisy. But when I had seen that they did not walk uprightly, according to the truth of the good message, I had said to Cephas before them all, "If you, being a Judean, live like a foreigner and not like a Judean, how do you compel the nations to imitate the Judeans?" So this confrontation may have also influenced Paul's decision regarding Mark, who was associated with Peter and perhaps even caught up in his hypocrisy. But that is only conjecture. We don't know that. What we do know is that Paul's misgivings about bringing along Mark had also irritated Barnabas to the point that he chose to separate from Paul completely. Despite having traveled with Paul for some years now, the two men, they had labored and suffered together. And maybe something else had to do with this, because we see in Galatians that Paul wrote to the Galatians that even Barnabas had been led away by them in hypocrisy. So perhaps we could conjecture that there was some lingering tension. Whatever the case may have been, because we don't know, we simply don't know, Paul did not convey any hard feelings against Barnabas when writing his first surviving epistle to the Corinthians roughly 8 years later. And his mention of Barnabas to the Corinthians infers that he was known among the assembly in Corinth by that time. Now we saw that Mark went with Barnabas to Cyprus after this disagreement in Antioch, while Paul, he selected Silas, and together they passed through Syria and Cilicia. "13 years after all of this, Paul was under house arrest in Rome. And writing to Timothy in his second surviving epistle to him, Paul asked Timothy that he come to Rome and that he bring Mark along with him, who ostensibly must have been in Ephesus with Timothy at the time of Paul's writing. So we read in Timothy, 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 11, "Lucas alone is with me," Luke the physician, the author of the Gospel of Luke and Acts. "Lucas alone is with me. Taking Marcus, bring him with yourself, for he is useful to me for the ministry." Regardless of whether Paul's original estimation of Mark was correct or not, a lot can change in 13 years. And now Paul expresses confidence in Mark. Ultimately, Mark would of course be incredibly valuable for generations to come, given that he would provide us a gospel. Now we know that Timothy followed Paul's instructions here faithfully, and indeed brought Mark with him to Rome, because Mark is later mentioned in Paul's epistle to the Colossians and to Philemon, and those epistles were written after this one. So we read in Colossians, "Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, and Marcus, the cousin of Barnabas, concerning whom you have received instructions. If he should come to you, receive him." And then in Philemon, which was likely sent along with the epistle to the Colossians, we read, "Greeting you are Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Yahshua, Marcus, Aristarchus, Demas, and Lucas, my colleagues. The favor of our Prince, Yahshua Christ, is with your spirits." So Mark was reconciled with Paul and ostensibly accompanied him until his death under Nero, which wouldn't have been very long after these epistles were written. 2 years at the absolute most, but likely shorter than that. Now the next and final place where we see Mark mentioned is in the salutation of Peter's first surviving epistle. The context of Peter's 2 surviving epistles suggests that he's writing to assemblies founded by Paul in Asia, which were in need of guidance after his arrest, or possibly his death. Because Mark is with Peter at this time, and not in Ephesus, nor in Rome, it's most likely that Paul had been executed by the time Peter wrote these epistles. So it's therefore evident that Mark traveled to Babylon to be with Peter not very long after Paul's death, around 63 AD. And we read in 1 Peter, "The elect woman in Babylon, and Marcus my son, greet you." Now it's likely necessary for us to make a digression here. And it's an unfortunate one. There is a largely Catholic superstition that Peter uses Babylon here as a coded reference to Rome. Now, those Catholics, they should be consistent and fair and honest and harmonious in this interpretation. So they should interpret the mystery Babylon of Revelation as Rome as well. Of course, they would never dare. There is no explicit evidence in Scripture that Peter was ever in Rome, though there is a tradition of it in some of the early Christian writers, and we did see some of those. While Irenaeus wrote that Peter and Paul laid down the foundations of a singular quote-unquote church in Rome, Paul makes no mention of such an assembly in his epistle to the Romans. He instead implies in that epistle that there were several assemblies in Rome. Now, in the lengthy salutation of that epistle, Paul makes no mention of Peter, and that's a lengthy salutation. It's the longest salutation out of all of Paul's epistles. He mentions a lot of people, but not a single mention of Peter, which really goes against Peter being in Rome. We wouldn't expect Peter to be in Rome anyways, because Peter, as Paul himself said, and as we see in Peter's own ministry, he was an ambassador for the circumcised, not the uncircumcised. And while there were certainly circumcised Judeans in Rome, Peter wouldn't have made it a priority to go there. Furthermore, concerning those circumcised Judeans in Rome, when Paul was later brought to Rome in chains, the leaders of the Judeans in Rome were eager to hear about Christianity from an apostle. So they go to him to hear about it. We see that in Acts 28. This implies they didn't have an opportunity to hear about Christianity from an apostle until now, which really goes against Peter ever being there. So people would wonder, what about all these witnesses and early Christian writers? Well, the fact of the matter is this. Interpolations, which are later additions to a text. Interpolations in favor of Catholic tradition are not far-fetched. The editors of the Ante-Nicene Fathers, translations of the writings of the Fathers down to AD 325, demonstrate that there were indeed some Roman Catholic interpolations of the works of Cyprian. The interpolations were supportive, as we would expect, of later Catholic doctrine, and can be proven as corruptions when compared against the older manuscripts. They're not present in the older manuscripts. Some later Catholic hand added it. And perhaps that is what happened with these early traditions. So it doesn't make sense for Peter to have ever been in Rome before Paul was brought there in chains. It doesn't make sense. There is no evidence of it. There is none whatsoever. But it does make sense that we see Peter in Babylon, because as we said, he was an ambassador to the circumcised. And Eastern Hebrew literature from the 2nd century does show a strong presence of circumcised Judeans in Mesopotamia. In fact, the language of Mark's Gospel strongly resembles a Shemitic use of Greek found in the text of that region. It is possible that many of these Judeans were descendants of those who didn't return to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. While the ancient city of Babylon itself was in ruins, so if someone says, well, he can't be in Babylon, that city was laid in heaps. Well, the reference to Babylon is as much a reference to the district and towns around the ancient city, which were still inhabited, and there are several sources, witnesses of that being the case. And we see that in Strabo's geography and Pliny's natural history. Those are two examples. Now, Peter, he penned his second surviving epistle not long after his first. And in that epistle, the apostle relates his absolute conviction that he will soon depart from his earthly tabernacle to be with Christ. It's not apparent how long after writing the epistle that Peter actually died, but it was imminent. And we read in Peter's second epistle, "Now I deem it righteous, for as long as I am in this tabernacle, to arouse you by reminder, knowing that soon is the putting aside of my tabernacle, just as also our Prince Yahshua Christ has shown me. And I shall also be diligent, that on every occasion you have a mention to do these things after my departure." He's, of course, referring to the admonishments he gives in that epistle. So Peter was quite convinced that his death was imminent. Now we know that Christ told Peter that he would not want to be brought to the place where he would die in some shape or form. And we can concede that it is possible that this was Rome. It is possible. We can never prove that, though. The Gospel of Mark has quite a few Latinisms, which are linguistic qualities of the Latin language. There's quite a few of them in Mark's Gospel, and that really does show that Mark wrote his Gospel with a Latin audience in mind. So it is possible that Peter was somehow brought from Babylon to Rome and then martyred in Rome, and that Mark came with him. That's possible. But it also isn't unreasonable to conjecture that maybe Mark returned to Rome after Peter's death. Maybe Peter died in Babylon, and then Mark went back to Rome. He was only in Rome maybe a year or two previous with Paul. Maybe he made some acquaintances there, right? Maybe he even had plans to return to Rome. It's also possible that Mark wrote his gospel in Babylon with ambitions to bring it back with him to Rome at a future date. There's so many theories you can give, right? We simply don't have enough precise information, so it's folly to try to determine which one of these, if any, are closer to the truth. But regardless of what may have transpired, Peter evidently never went to Rome before Paul's death in 63 AD, if he ever went at all. If he ever went at all, it wasn't before Paul's death. There is one more thing which can be addressed concerning John Mark, and this one is pretty interesting. And it's concerning the peculiar passage in his gospel, in his 14th chapter. In this passage, we see mentioned a man wrapped with a linen cloth in Gethsemane during the night of Christ's arrest. Ostensibly, the man was dressed this way because he was just earlier bathing in the brook of Kidron, running through the garden. It was late at night, maybe he had a long day, and he was bathing in the river. And then after getting out of the river, hearing all the commotion, he wrapped himself in a linen cloth and went to see what was going on. He is described by Mark as having fled naked upon being seized by the men, by the soldiers. And many have postulated that this man may be Mark himself, who would have been in Jerusalem for the Passover. This is a reasonable conjecture. It really actually is, because it would explain why Mark takes the time to add this relatively minor detail. Why would Mark take the time to mention this, right? Maybe it's him. The gospel writers are humble. They never bring attention to themselves, right? If Mark was indeed this man, then it's also possible that he was a student of Christ, or perhaps even one of the 72. It's possible. We will likely never know until we get to the kingdom. We pray this was sufficient to discuss John Mark and who he was, and now we'll move on to the dating of his gospel, which is quite important. There is not the slightest grain of doubt among the early historical witnesses that Matthew wrote first, and we saw that. And several early writers claimed that the Gospel of Matthew was originally written in Hebrew. The substance of the Gospel of Matthew itself does suggest that it was written for a Hebrew audience. There is a lot of evidence for it. So we see that the internal evidence is substantiated by the historical testimonies. Translators of the Dead Sea Scrolls, such as Jean, and this is a French name, so forgive me, such as Jean Carmignac, have claimed that the linguistic qualities of Matthew suggest that it is a translation of an earlier Hebrew work. There are certainly elements of Matthew which evoke a feeling that the ink was put to the papyrus not long after the ascension, such as when Matthew writes that the high priests and their lies concerning the burial tomb of Christ were still uttered by the Judeans until this day today. A written gospel would have been desirable from the earliest time, and especially after the Christian communities were scattered following the martyrdom of Stephen. It is reasonable to estimate that Matthew was written in Judea sometime between 32 to 42 AD, and the high priests and their lies were very fresh in people's memory. Luke was not himself an eyewitness of the ministry of Christ, but he was an exacting historian seeking to compile a faithful and focused account of the ministry of Christ. Acts is a continuation of his gospel account. It pretty much picks up right where Luke left off. So it was certainly written afterwards, and through Acts, we can date Luke. We can actually estimate Luke's dating much more precisely than we can with Matthew's. Acts continues up until the time of Paul's house arrest in Rome, and mentions that he abode in a house for 2 years. But then, the account ends abruptly, without making any mention of Paul's martyrdom. It therefore must have been written during this time, and perhaps it was finished shortly before Paul's execution. It is also possible that it was written shortly after Paul arrived in Rome, and that the last 2 verses were a later addendum by Luke. Because Luke remained with Paul in Rome, it would have been an excellent opportunity for them to sit down and record his gospel and mission for Christ. So while we can't decisively say how long of a time there was between the composition of Luke and Acts, what we can say confidently is that Luke was written before Paul's death in 63 AD. Irenaeus, he stated that Mark was written after Peter's death, and Papias implies it. And if these testimonies are true, then it certainly pushes Mark past 63 AD, as Peter almost certainly died sometime after Paul, as we just saw earlier. There is no reason for Mark to have waited very long to compile Peter's preaching into a gospel, so it's quite fair to date Mark sometime between 64 to 70 AD. Earlier in this presentation, we cited Eusebius's quotation of Clement of Alexandria concerning the authorship of Mark, and we can also see with Clement an early witness which supports our proposed ordering of the Gospels. And we read, again in the same books, Clement gives the tradition of the earliest elders as to the order of the Gospels in the following manner. The Gospels containing the genealogies, he says, were written first. And that would of course be Matthew and Luke, which is what we saw the evidence led us towards, that Matthew and Luke were written first. There is little doubt whatsoever that Mark was written third. And with this, perhaps we can propose an answer to the Synoptic Question. So if we are going to address why there are similarities between the 3 Synoptic Gospels, then we can start by saying that Matthew, having written first, had no source except his own memories and those of his fellow ambassadors and followers of Christ. It's really that simple. Now, if there was any writer who might have used another gospel as a reference, it would certainly, as we've before said, it would certainly be Luke, who by his own admission carefully compiled his gospel from the testimonies of others. It is very hard to imagine that Luke would have been ignorant of Matthew's gospel. No way. No, he would not have been. If Luke had on occasion consulted Matthew, then this explains where their gospels agree in their accounts and construction, and Q is not needed. In fact, Q was never needed if extant accounts were taken into consideration. We could conjecture that Matthew's Hebrew-oriented gospel was not yet as readily available to some of the assemblies across the Oecumene, the inhabited society, and Luke might have taken care to include some of Matthew's accounts for that very reason. Maybe many of the assemblies among the uncircumcised, maybe many of them had never had the opportunity to read Matthew's gospel. So now, taking some accounts from Matthew, Luke was giving them the opportunity to do so. As for when Luke presents unique accounts or details which Matthew did not specify, Luke would have had the testimonies of all the men and women whom he and Paul knew and had fellowship with, and that would have been many people. Luke was considering many testimonies at the same time, and he was putting them together methodically, as he himself said. While we are not fond of nor agree with many of their methods of textual criticism, many writers have agreed with our assertion concerning Luke having borrowed from Matthew and not from Mark, and that Q is therefore not needed. For example, we read from David Barrett Peabody's work, One Gospel from Two, Mark's use of Matthew and Luke. Page 6, we read, "If the hundreds of minor agreements scattered throughout the triple tradition are seen to merge with and form a pattern with the scores of major agreements, then it becomes increasingly apparent that Luke was primarily dependent on Matthew and not Mark, and there is no need for Q or the priority of Mark." So that explains Matthew and Luke. Now for Mark. Matthew and Peter were both witnesses of the same ministry, and we can see that Peter essentially condensed Mark's gospel into his preaching. This explains why Mark barely has any double tradition with Luke at all, but has so much in common with Matthew. 76% in the triple tradition and 18% in their double tradition. Mark's gospel is Peter's oral preaching, and Peter's oral preaching was basically an oral account of Matthew's gospel from Peter's own perspective. So we see that the content of the Synoptic Gospels is harmonious with the historical witnesses concerning their authorship. It is truly a blessing that the Gospel was organized in this way, because having several witnesses enriches it with a vivid clarity, and the resulting harmony between them just testifies all the more towards their veracity. Having four Gospels testifies towards the truth of Christ fourfold. With this lengthy but necessary exposition on the authorship and dating of Mark hopefully thoroughly explored, we may now turn to its peculiar style, which I believe is one of its most brilliant aspects. The language of Mark is simple. It keeps its longer discourses and teachings relatively brief, short teachings, short parables, and it focuses instead on the deeds and the works of Christ. The gospel maintains a fast and active pace from beginning to end, with Mark using the word euthus 41 times, which is often translated as immediately or straight away. It's a very fast, action-oriented gospel. But why does it have this peculiar style? We can remember that the early Christian writers, they testified that Mark was careful to preserve the authenticity of Peter's preaching in his writing, being cautious not to add or redact any wording. And this would explain why Mark reads like a verbal sermon instead of like a literary gospel. If Mark faithfully recorded Peter's preaching, then we would expect his gospel to be written more how you would speak a story than how you would write one. That is why Mark has this peculiar style. If you try reading Mark out loud, you can see all this for yourself. Your speech is naturally more simple than your writing, and it is also naturally more pleonastic, more wordy. It is easier to economize your words when you're writing when you're taking your time and can really think about what you want to write down next. So we would expect Mark to be the most verbose of the Gospels if it really is the authentic preservation of Peter's preaching. Well, Mark is the most verbose of the Gospels. The extemporaneous origin of Mark has made it a captivating and picturesque gospel. Yes, Mark shares 97% of its accounts with either Matthew or Luke or both. It does. But this is not often mentioned, that those accounts are often longer and often more descriptive in Mark. Peter's preaching comes to life through Mark's gospel, and I think most of us can agree that fishermen, they tend to be talented storytellers. This was the gospel which was shared by the campfire. This was the gospel which was shared by the sea, shared and given by a man who was himself, as he said, a spectator of the majesty of Christ. To see an example of these qualities in Mark, we may compare to 3 gospel accounts of when Christ calmed the storm. So we'll read them all, and we'll see which one is the most extemporaneous and pleonastic. So Matthew chapter 8, verses 23 to 25. And with his boarding into a vessel, his students followed him. And behold, a great commotion happened on the sea, so for the vessel to be covered by the waves, but he slept. And coming forth, they roused him, saying, Prince, save us, we are being destroyed. And that's Matthew. Now for Luke, chapter 8, verses 22 to 24. And it happened in one of those days that he and his students boarded into a vessel. And he said to them, We should pass through to the other side of the lake. And they set out. Then most of them had fallen asleep, and a furious storm of wind descended upon the lake, and being filled with water, then they were endangered. So drawing near, they aroused him, saying, Master, Master, we are being destroyed. And awakening, he censured the wind and the waves of water, and they stopped, and it became calm. And finally, Mark, chapter 4, verses 35 to 38. And he says to them on that day, it being late, we should go across to the other side. And having left the crowd, they took him, as he was in the vessel, and other vessels were with his. And there came a great tempest of wind, and the waves cast upon the vessel, so for the vessel to be already filled, and he was in the stern, sleeping upon a cushion. And they arouse him and say to him, Teacher, is it not a concern to you that we are destroyed? So we can see an example of how Mark is much more expressive and naturally fit for being spoken aloud. If we go to the account right after the calming of the storm in the Synoptic Gospels, we can see an example of how the accounts in Mark are often longer and often more descriptive. Matthew 8:28. And upon his coming to the other side, to the country of the Gadarenes, 2 men possessed by demons, coming out from among the tombs, met with him, exceedingly troublesome, so that not anyone is able to pass by through that road. And Luke 8:26 to 27. Then they came ashore in the region of the Gadarenes, which is opposite the coast of Galilee. And with his coming out upon the land, he met a certain man from the city, having demons, and for considerable time who had not worn a garment, and has abode not in a house, but among the tombs. And finally, Mark 5:1 to 4. And they came to the other side of the sea, to the region of the Gadarenes. And upon his coming out from the vessel, immediately a man with an unclean spirit from among the tombs met him, who had a dwelling among the tombs. And not even in chains was anyone any longer able to bind him, on account that often he, having been bound in fetters and chains, and the chains being torn apart by him, and the fetters being shattered, and no one prevails to overpower him. So we can see how the other Gospels are much more economized in their language than Mark, whose Gospel is also a little more naturally fit to be read aloud. We can safely conjecture that Peter couldn't help but be expressive when relating these things which he himself witnessed. And many unique details straight from Peter's own memories are found throughout the Gospel of Mark. An example would be when Christ went out to pray early in the morning after he had healed Peter's mother-in-law, and not just her, but afterwards many people who were pressing at the door. So we'll read from Luke first, and then we can compare Luke to Mark. So we read in Luke chapter 4, verse 42. Then day coming, departing, he went to a desert place, and the crowd sought him. And having come unto him, then they detained him, for which not to go away from them. And now we read from Mark, chapter 1, verses 35 to 37. And in the morning, having arisen very late at night, he went out and departed into a desert place, and there he prayed. And Simon and those with him pursued soon after him, and they found him, and say to him that they all seek you. Do you see how easier it is to read Mark out loud? Do you see how this is Peter's preaching? This is extemporaneous preaching. This is Peter's preaching, authentically and faithfully preserved by Mark in writing, just as the early historical witnesses say. This is something I truly love about Mark's Gospel, and I don't think it's talked about enough. This is why the Gospel of Mark reads like an eyewitness account, despite being written by Mark, who was likely not an eyewitness of Christ, though he might have been. The early historical witnesses, they pretty much agree he wasn't, but he might have been. The Gospel of Mark reads like a first-hand account because it's a faithful preservation of an eyewitness's memories, as the eyewitness himself would relate them orally. Basically, everything in Mark's Gospel which is unique about it can be explained through the fact that it's a faithful preservation of Peter's oral preaching, that it has an oral source. Anything difficult to memorize is absent from Mark, such as Christ's genealogy and the longer parables, which is what we would expect if this was Peter's preaching. Mark does not have any longer teachings either, apart from the Olivet Discourse, which is understandably shorter in this gospel than it is in Matthew. In regards to memory, there are micro versions of a literary technique called chiastic structure in Mark. Chiastic structure is when a narrative is presented with a sort of symmetrical pattern. And we have an example from Genesis here. This is a valuable mnemonic device, which the ancients used to help them memorize poetry. So we find it in Homer's works. Because Mark is the preservation of oral preaching, it is not a coincidence that we find such patterns in its structure. And even many men today have, just for the joy of it, taken to memorizing Mark. There's many men who have memorized the entire Gospel of Mark. It's just built for that. That's why we don't see a genealogy in Mark. It would be hard to imagine Peter preaching this gospel and just preaching a genealogy from memory. Son of this, son of this, son of this, son of this. No, he's giving a very vivid and expressive account of what he himself saw, his memories. This is the Messiah who I knew and witnessed. I was a spectator of his majesty. So we don't see a genealogy in Mark. If we take into account that this gospel is Mark's faithful preservation of Peter's preaching, then we can answer many of the questions concerning its unique style and composition. Why is it shorter? it has an oral source, and brevity would have made it easier to memorize and efficiently convey. Why does it not include the virgin birth? Ostensibly because Peter strove to only mention what he himself saw as much as he was able. Of course, he wouldn't have been able to do that with much of the passion narrative, but where he could do it, he certainly did. This preaching style of Peter is also recorded in Acts, where Peter would focus on the public life, death, and resurrection of Christ. He wouldn't speak of the virgin birth or anything of that sort. He would focus on what he himself was witness to. And that accords perfectly with Mark's gospel. Why does it have simple language? Well, it has an oral source. Why is it more verbose? Well, it has an oral source. Pleonasm is an excellent aspect of oral storytelling. Here's an example of pleonasm from Mark's Gospel, from chapter 1, verse 32. And upon its becoming late, when the sun sank. That's how you tell a story around a campfire. And upon its becoming late, when the sun sank, right? That's how you say a story, not how you write one. Another example would be saying something like, I heard it with my very own ears. That's a pleonasm. Why does the Gospel of Mark have more Aramaic words, right, that are transliterated? Well, it has an oral source, and citing phrases as you remember them, being spoken, can be an immersive experience for the listener. So a famous example of that would be when Christ says to Jairus' daughter, Talitha cum, which means, as it's interpreted, little girl, arise. Imagine Peter standing there and saying, and there I was, as Christ, he held her hand, and we were all silent, seeing what would happen next. And he said to her, Talitha cum. That's how you say a story. That's how you relate a story. Peter is the brilliant storyteller. Now, Papias wrote that Mark was not overly concerned with chronology, but none of the Gospels were ever intended to be a complete and exhaustive biography on the earthly life and ministry of Christ. Their primary purpose was to provide the most important details necessary for Christian deportment and understanding. As John wrote near the end of his gospel, now indeed also many other signs Yahshua did before his students, things which are not written in this book. But these things are written in order that you may believe that Yahshua is the anointed Son of Yahweh, and that believing you would have life in his name. Now, it is interesting how Mark is often silent, where other accounts specify that it was Peter who said or did something. So, for example, the Gospel makes no mention of Peter walking on water, or neither does it make any mention that it was Peter who cut off Malchus's ear. This is a similar humility, I believe, which Matthew and John had in their accounts. And in doing so, Peter would not distract anyone from the importance of the narrative. If you say, and then I started walking on the water and I started coming to Christ, but he doesn't want the focus to be on him, the focus is on Christ. And we see that same pattern in the Acts of the Apostles as well. Something unique to Mark's ending is the singling out of Peter's name in the instructions given to the woman. His name is singled out. And this peculiar mention of Peter again agrees of Peter being the source of the gospel. So the angel, or the youth, as Mark records him, he says to the woman, Mark 16:7, but you go tell his students and Petros that he goes on before you into Galilee. There you shall see him, just as he said to you. The account then ends relatively abruptly, one verse after this. Mark ends suddenly. and it's not clear if Mark ever finished his gospel. There is a lengthy interpolation that follows this in some manuscripts, but which is missing in the earlier 4th century manuscripts, and for that reason, it should certainly be rejected. It also has a few contradictions with the other Gospels. That makes sense. These interpolations, as short as they are, they're never able to make it work. That shows you the Bible is true. The Bible, written by all these different men, inspired by the same Spirit, at all these different times, and they're all harmonious in incredibly profound ways. Yet such a short interpolation, written by some later scribe, can't help but contradict things. They simply can't do it. It's also unsurprising that this spurious interpolation does not have the same oral style as the rest of Mark's gospel. It actually reads more like a literary gospel. That demonstrates that it has a different hand. It's not from Peter's preaching. Now, we could conjecture that Mark's rather abrupt ending might have been intentional. Christ had personally appeared to Peter after his resurrection. We know this. And Peter told this to the other ambassadors. We know this. Paul mentions it, I believe, in 1 Corinthians, and we see it also mentioned in Luke. Though the appearance is not mentioned in Luke, but in Luke we see mentioned that the ambassadors relate to Cleophas and the other man on the road to Emmaus. They say to him, they say, you know, the prince certainly is risen, and he's appeared to Peter. So those are two witnesses that Christ also appeared to Peter, but that specific appearance is never elaborated upon, and we don't see it in any of the Gospels. Perhaps the details of this appearance are not recorded for a reason. Perhaps it was something dearly personal to Peter. The last time he saw Yahshua was when he denied him. Both Mark and Peter were Hebrews, and there is no evidence that Mark was as schooled in Greek as Luke or Paul. So we should perhaps expect to find a few Hebraisms in Mark's text. And while some of them may be dismissed as mere stylistic choices, such as the placing of verbs at the beginning of sentences, that might just be Mark or Peter's style. There are other aspects of Mark's grammar which are irrefutably Hebrew. For example, the relative pronoun, who, which, in Hebrew is indeclinable and without gender. So a personal pronoun, him, her, must follow and provide clarity. And for that reason, pronouns in Hebrew are naturally redundant. But this is completely unnecessary in Greek, which is a highly inflected language. But Mark uses pronouns redundantly anyways, such as when we read in Mark 7:25. But immediately a woman hearing about him, of whom her daughter had an unclean spirit, having come, fell to his feet. Of whom her daughter. This clause literally reads in Greek as, whose daughter of her, which is awkward. It would be more grammatically proper to amend the redundant relative pronoun his here to make it read, whose daughter. Other examples of Hebraisms in Mark include redundant prepositions, adjectival substitutes, and the use of Hebrew parallelisms. These are all clues that the author is a Hebrew speaker writing in a second language. But with Koine Greek being the lingua franca at the time, one shouldn't jump to the conclusion that Mark was struggling to write in Greek. No, not exactly. His use of Greek is in fact very similar to a Shemitic use of the language found in apocryphal Hebrew literature of the East, written both before and after the ministry of Christ, Remember, Mark spent time with Peter in Babylon. So it makes sense to see this style with Mark. There are also several transliterations of Aramaic words in Mark, which show the author's familiarity with the language. This also proves that the Gospel was originally penned in Greek. Otherwise, the Aramaic words would have been translated. It is quite evident that every book of the New Testament was originally written in Greek, except perhaps Matthew. And then, of course, there is the Latin. While there are Latin words which appear in more than one Gospel, such as denarius and census, in Mark we find peculiar Latin words where Matthew and Luke would have used the equivalent Greek word instead. In Mark we find words such as centurion. Both Matthew and Luke use ekatontrikes, the equivalent term in Greek. In Mark we see speculator, a bodyguard, a scout executioner. And in Mark we see sextarius, a unit of measurement nearly equaling a pint. Mark also has Latin translations of Greek words on 2 occasions, where we see the use of quadrans instead of peptaduo, and praetorium instead of alles. Though Mark isn't the only gospel writer who does this, so that should be said as well. Mark also used Latin idioms, but this isn't extraordinary, as some of them are also used elsewhere in the New Testament and other Greek writings. But it is interesting. And perhaps what's most interesting is that Mark takes the time to elaborate upon Judean customs, which shows that he did not expect his readers to be familiar with them. Mark explains that 2 yepta, a Judean coin, is equivalent to a quadrang, a Roman coin, at Mark 12:42. Mark provides some context for the traditions of the elders at 7 verses 3-4. He provides some context for the Passover at chapter 14 verse 12 and the preparation day at chapter 15 verse 42. It is also evident that Mark didn't expect his readers to be familiar with the geography of Jerusalem, since he mentions that the Mount of Olives was opposite the temple at chapter 13, verse 3. The Latinisms and explanations of Judean customs certainly do suggest that Mark wrote his gospel in Rome for a Roman audience. And we discussed that possibility earlier. But the Latinisms do not make it definitively certain. It suggests it, but it's not certain. We have to remember Rome held the hegemony, and many of these idioms and terms, they had become colloquial by Mark's time. This is why we can see some of them in other New Testament books. And this should end our introduction to the Gospel of Mark, which was really also an introduction to the Gospels as a whole. Throughout this series, we will be reading from the Christogenia New Testament, which is translated by William Finck and prioritizes the earliest surviving manuscripts. We will discuss the Greek wherever it seems appropriate and make note of any significant variance between the manuscripts. There do appear to be many in Mark compared to the other Gospels. If they seem important, we will seek to bring them up when we can. Indeed, with 2 or 3 witnesses is a matter established. But Yahweh went beyond the law, and he gave us 4. 4 accounts working together to create a cohesive whole, of which Mark is an excellent preservation of Peter's preaching and a wonderful introduction to the Gospels. This concludes our introduction to the Gospel of Mark, and Yahweh willing, we will return with Mark's first chapter relatively shortly. Praise Yahweh, the God of Israel, and thank you for watching.